Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Leon Hartwell. I'm a senior associate at LSE IDEAS. Today marks our 32nd LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine Dialogue, a series that we launched in the aftermath of the February 2022 escalation of the war. We are part funded by PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, which delivers research and tracks data on conflict and its resolution. This week, we will aim to provide a nuanced and informed discussion of how Kremlin narratives have changed since the February 2022 escalation. Russia's military intervention in Ukraine aligns with its ongoing global information warfare. Its disinformation campaigns encompass various themes, including unfounded allegations of Ukrainian and NATO aggression through false flags operations, claims of ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking population outside of Russia are facing genocide, and assertions that NATO and Ukraine are actively developing biological weapons aimed at targeting Russians in the future. Consequently, many Russians perceive themselves to be confronting an existential peril, necessitating their protection and, outside of Russia, their liberation. Simultaneously, Russian disinformation campaigns also exert significant influence within the Western world. If the Kremlin's efforts prove successful, they could potentially impact the level and type of support provided by NATO members to Ukraine. Our panelists today will focus on Russia's official statements, media coverage, and social media messaging to identify key themes and trends in the country's evolving narrative. To discuss these issues, I'm joined by an all-phenomenal panel of distinguished panelists. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Julia Davis, a Ukrainian-born American columnist for the Daily Beast. In line with her diet of consuming Russian propaganda for breakfast, dinner, and lunch, she naturally became the founder of Russian Media Monitor. Welcome, Davis. Julia. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Cassidy, a specialist in digital diplomacy and lecturer in diplomatic studies at the University of Oxford. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ivana Stradner, research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She specializes in Russia's information operations and security. Let's first turn to Julia. If you could unmute for me, please. What are the main goals of Russian information warfare? Is there ultimately a difference in how Russia views information warfare versus the West? Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's my pleasure to participate. The way Russia sets up its information operations, they're designed to discourage through the use of disinformation and also to cause the lack of unity amongst the nations that are opposing its aggression. So these are its main goals. And as far as its own population, it's the opposite. They want to unite and embolden them also through the use of disinformation. Now that these worlds seem to be crossing over and the Western media is becoming more aware of what's being said by Russian in its own domestic propaganda, they're trying to incorporate a bit of both. And they had to change their strategy because in the beginning, this was supposed to be a quick, successful war. The West was anticipated to impose minimal sanctions. Basically, they thought it would be the repeat of the way it happened with Crimea. And since it backfired, they had to change their strategies on the move. But their main strategy right now is to discourage NATO countries and basically any countries that tend to support Ukraine, to discourage them, to convince them that it harms their own interests, and also to bring discord and divisions, to interrupt lines of communication, to cause internal divisions in the countries that are opposing Russian aggression, and also to cause divisions between Ukraine and all of its allies in the world.
Thank you, Julia. That's a great opening for us there, and maybe you could elaborate later also on the issue that Russia sees information warfare as something that happens during peace or wartime. So that's a very important point also. Let's first go to Jennifer now. Now, Jennifer, you took a deep dive on Russian narratives prior to February 2022. What were the main narratives that were churned out prior to the February 2022 escalation of the war? Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll very much try to keep to the time frame on this, but just to give a bit of context. So for my PhD study, the Euromaidan movement and the war in Ukraine, the beginnings of it, up to 4 months after the annexation of Crimea, and I completed the world's first PhD on digital diplomacy before we even kind of knew it was the thing. We were just hoping it would become a thing by the time I finished my PhD, and we were like, fingers crossed. As I used to be a diplomat as noted, for a number of years, so I have every single tweet and Facebook post from every embassy, every ambassador, and every foreign ministry posted in Kyiv and their headquarters from the 21st November 2013 all the way up to 4 months after the annexation of Crimea. And my PhD was specifically on online strategic narratives. So it didn't have a term at the time. I was just making up terms because there was not a strategic narrative. So now we're talking, so that's just to give you the background on that. So I'm not going to go, as I said, post, this is very much the Euromaidan movement and what we had seen. So the way I look at narratives, we have the international systems narrative and national narratives and issue narratives, and all countries engage in this when they're engaging in information warfare. And for Russia, it was somewhat confusing, and I'm very willing to be challenged on this, but confusing to some observers, including some Russian sources that I delved into, the seemingly propagandist unpreparedness of the Russian government during the early days of the conflict, because they believed they'd already created, this is the conflict February 24 to in 2022, because they believe they already had a very established online strategic narrative, or just a strategic narrative there, and looking at that a little bit more closer, we can see that there was a solid effort to piece together Russian narratives in the recent past, and it's not necessary to rehash the whole construction, but we saw that regarding the international systems narratives, that's Russia to the world and to the international bodies, they were communicating a multipolar world where the influence of the West was waning, but its interventionism and human rights engagement prevented the natural multipolar balance from occurring. And even more, that the West was contributing to the entropy of the entire global system. Nuanced reading would point out there was very different readings of the US and Europe, and we can get to that. But generally, the US plays the enemy role in this narrative pre-2022 and still, of course, today. And Europe is often seen as an easily doped US pawn or US occupied territory. Regarding the national narrative, Russia is put out that it is the great power responsible for European and global order as a positive feature of its past and as Russia's most distinguishing feature, and very much the historical retelling of the great power of Russia and its special status in Europe. And then finally, the issue-specific narrative. So I always have, there's 3 layers of narratives that I analyze. The issue-specific narratives are still are integrated and emanate from the national and systematic one, and existed long before the Crimea annexation. Some trace the justification for the invasion back to 2008, and we look at President Putin's essay on historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. This is not a narrative innovation, but it has a conceptual history rooted in Russian nationalism. So I'll end there because I'm worried to have time. There's a lot to take in, but that there is a number of narratives that are used, and they're very strategic in the sense of who they're pointed at, and particularly who is the other. And we all have that, and that's nothing new to that's not a Russian made tool, the other, But I'll end it there to keep it in time.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think it overlaps with some of the things that Julia said, depending on its audience, of course, Russia has different narratives, and depending on the time, also, you can see sort of evolving narratives. One commentator described it as the spaghetti approach. If you keep on throwing spaghetti at the wall, something will stick. So I'd be interested to hear from Ivana, who closely observes the Russian information warfare pretty much all over the place, but also in the US also. Ivana, since February 2022, what are the main Kremlin narratives targeting Western audiences? How effective are those narratives? Thank you, Ivana. You're muted.
Thank you very much again for inviting me to this panel to talk about, in my view, a tremendously important topic, because what Julia was emphasizing also, how Russia perceives it differently from the West. And indeed, it's part, of a hybrid warfare. And I always like to tell people that if the Russian military strategists openly talk that in the ongoing, information technologies, they believe, that information and psychological warfare will actually largely lay the groundwork for a victory. As a matter of fact, even the chief of staff of the Russian military, he values non-military to military measures 4-to-1. So no wonder why Russia actually deeply cares about this. So one thing, that I notice, I always like to tell people, I was one of those strange people in 2021 talking about potential of Russia's invasion, not because I had some special, information, but rather because I understand very well how Russia is setting informational conditions prior to using the kinetic use of force. And as soon as I saw a tremendous cloud of information regarding biological weapons, narratives, bioweapons and American-led biolabs, I knew, for example, that something was off. So in terms of the West, I think nowadays, we have significantly more information of what's going on. And but the main narratives have not changed drastically since 2014, in the sense that they actually blame, for example, NATO for NATO expansion. They also blame the West for causing this war, let alone, the United States, and using what I always like to tell, in the West as a meat grinder in Ukraine. One other narrative that I noticed is also related to biological weapons and American-led biolabs in Ukraine and Africa. And it has a much bigger potential and repercussions that I would like to speak with you maybe later on. Another thing that I've noticed, of course, there is always nuclear threats, and they understand very well that people in the West, when they think about nukes, they always think about Armageddon. So for them, it's a great opportunity to deter people in their minds. Why? Because the more people are afraid of potential nuclear war that can also have implications on their own security, they will be less inclined to help Ukraine. That's, one other narratives. Then I also see the narrative related to food security, and blaming again, the United States in particular for causing a security crisis and trying to make further wedges between the United States and Europe. Then, for example, there is another interesting narrative that at the beginning of the war, where Russia wanted to portray this war as a humanitarian intervention for defending its own people from Nazi, and that has not gone away. It's still there. Then, for example, there is another interesting narrative that I've noticed, which is related to imperialism, blaming the West, in particular, the United States and the United Kingdom, for imperialism and colonialism. There are, of course, numerous false claims, about Ukraine's affinity for Russia, and why, Ukraine is actually the part of Russia, but which you also mentioned in the United States, while a lot of people probably on this call can laugh about all those disinformation campaigns. They're very, very effective, especially because there are numerous parroting coming from within the United States, especially on the far right and the far left, parroting those narratives. And that can actually resonate significantly more with people here in the US than, hearing some random blogger on Telegram channel from Russia talking about those narratives. The very similar thing is happening also in Europe. And due to time limitations, I will end here. But my last point will be that all those narratives, as Julia emphasized, they also serve to polarize people, but also to weaponize the First Amendment here in the United States, and probably very soon what you are going to see on the freedom of speech in Europe. So this is precisely why we need to pay more attention to those narratives. If Putin wants to make this war a protracted war, I do believe that one of the best ways that he can succeed in this, if he actually succeeds in information warfare, because perception matters.
Thank you, Ivana. And I think you pointed out something really important. It's not just something that's directed at the far left or the far right, it's directed at everyone. So there's sort of a narrative that speaks to the hearts and minds of every group. Now let's turn back to as she's known, the Russian TV whisperer to American audiences, Julia Davis. Julia, you consume, of course, Russian news so that we don't have to. Now, 2/3 of Russians use television as their primary source of Russian news, as far as I understand. What are the main post-February 2022 narratives about the war, especially the ones directed at Russian audiences? And how effective are those narratives? How have they changed and why? Thank you, Julia.
Well, the very first narrative was that they were going to Ukraine to fight the Nazis, and also claiming that Ukraine was about to attack Russia, and therefore they had no choice but to go in to stop them. But that has not been very effective, as pundits on their own shows often express. It just did not take. The Russian people did not feel in any danger from Ukrainians. So that narrative had to be amended. And the most prevalent narrative right now is, oh, we're not fighting Ukraine at all. Ukraine no longer exists. What we're fighting is NATO, and the main enemies are the United States and Great Britain. So that is the main narrative, that they're fighting the satanic West that is trying to impose on them the system of values that they reject, and they have to win. And also there's another interesting difference as well, where they present this vision of a multipolar world to their global audiences. On their domestic arena, their experts are talking about that when this war is over, Russia is going to rule the world, and they have to start coming up with ideas and principles upon which this new world headed by Russia will operate. So there's a paramount difference there. It also makes an effort to convince the Russians that they would be dying, not just to steal some part of Ukraine, which is in reality what they're after, but that they're dying for this larger idea for Russia's domination in the world, that if they don't win, they will end up in concentration camps, that the West intends to enslave them or kill them, that this is when they say Nazi, by the way, it's a creative interpretation. They don't mean what the rest of us in the free world think Nazism is about. They're claiming that it's the West trying to exterminate the Russians, and they're the real victims of this Nazism. And so they're trying to tell their people they will end up as zombies. One of the pundits actually claimed that Russians will end up in Western zoos, where they will sit there chained and be shown to the children. Just these horror stories that are convincing them that they have to win, they can't stop, otherwise the West will enslave them or destroy them. And they're also admitting that there is a lack of ammo, there's lack of people to fight this war. They're having to ratchet up this, and what you described as throwing spaghetti on the wall, there's an expression that the Russians have about hanging spaghetti on the ears. And what they actually mean is the same thing. They throw whatever they can think of, and it will find its recipient. It will stick with someone. So they have this multitude of different fronts, religious idea that they're fighting against Satanism, trying to revive the great patriotic war fervor by saying they're fighting Nazis, and trying to unite the Russians behind this idea that NATO is after them, and if they don't win, they will perish.
Julia, can I just quickly follow up on a question also? Recently in the news, there's been some attacks by Wagner's boss on the defense minister and a few other Russian elites. What do you make of that? What purpose does that serve?
Their war is not going well. Someone has to be the scapegoat. It's quite possible that he is attacking Shoigu and Gerasimov with Putin's blessing, because he seems to be awfully emboldened, and the way he speaks, he's totally fearless. So either his ego got the best of him, or he's doing it with Putin's blessing. Despite their best propaganda efforts, they have to acknowledge this war is not going well. It's going nothing like they have anticipated, and someone has to pay the price. Somebody has to be the fall guy. So Prigozhin certainly would like to portray himself as a hero. He compares himself to Robin Hood, and he pins all the blame on Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov. And that's what seems to be his goal in mind, make himself to be the hero in this situation, possibly with some payoff once this war is over, a position of some sort, while getting rid of them as his opponents. He also recounted humiliations by Shoigu when he would ask for ammunition for his forces. So there's obviously infighting going on there. So he's definitely gunning for them, but at the same time expressing his fealty to Putin. And that makes me think Putin may be just fine with what he's doing.
Thank you, Julia. So in essence, the facts on the ground also dictate what happens with the narratives that they churn out. Let's go back to Jennifer. Jennifer, what are your main observations regarding recent trends in how Russia has been using social media? Because the use of social media has changed just in a very short period of time, since 2014, for example, versus now. What are your observations?
Yeah, well, it certainly has, to the extent that there wasn't one, when I started my PhD on it in 2013, there wasn't one written paper on the use of social media. And when I worked in the UN, we weren't allowed to use it in the hall. You weren't physically allowed to use it. Or when I worked in the Khmer Rouge tribunals, you were not allowed to use these devices. So to say that's my job to analyze it's changed. So the change has been extremely dramatic, both on the quote unquote Western front, and also on the Russian side. But I just wanted to bring in, before I forget, a Hannah Arendt quote that I think encapsulates a lot of what we've been saying so far. And it's, when I read it the first time, a lot of things clicked to me. And she writes it in 1951 in her book The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she says, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced communist or the ardent Nazi, but the person for whom fact and fiction and truth and falsehood no longer exist. And I think that is one of the most powerful quotes. And My students joke that I developed a cult of personality around her. I'm like, well, there's worse people develop a cult of personality around, I feel. But, you know, the idea of saying this came from very pertinent point, saying, you know, we can laugh at this hysterical notion of that they are trying to, you know, denazify, or we're seeing a more dominant narrative of particularly anti-LGBT, that the Western society is trying to turn Russia's children, you know, all of Russia's children, gay or transgender, and we can think this is, you know, so absurd and hysterical, and many do in both Ukraine and Russia, but it's the people in the middle. And if you keep altering the narrative, if you keep changing the line, people start to question things, and they're the people, when the person for whom fact and fiction and truth and falsehood no longer exists. That's the issue, when you can't distinguish it. But I digress, or I digressed. You know, look, it's not the first, you know, as someone who exclusively looks at social media during times of political crisis, it's not the first war to be played out during a crisis. Even the Euromaidan movement, arguably the Arab Spring, it's not a war, but we could argue that was the first one. But it is by far the most meticulous we have never seen. Well, I certainly have never seen anything like it. The data, like the fact that I could collect every single tweet and Facebook post for those days mentioned. If I was to do that today, I'd have to pick a certain amount of countries and say, I'm only doing X, Y, and Z, because the data would be so great. There was no way you could code and analyze it and gain a narrative. So one key issue regarding Russia's how Russia's using it is, well, look, they're limited. Social media, they're limited by, I focus a lot on the foreign policy of Silicon Valley, and I'd be interesting if we get to a Q&A. I'm really interested always to hear people's thoughts on this, because I sway on it, of whether this is a good thing, whether whether Silicon Valley should have left should have removed that information, because you are not allowing for the independent. So yes, it's good for their brand. So regarding how Russia's using it, we've got Telegram, and initially we saw, and I know we're going to get onto that later, but initially we saw that as, you know, an app that this is great for, you know, forewarning of attacks and cyber warfare and all this, but the virality of it, and the fact that now you have key figures, pro-Kremlin figures using it, and the extent of the groups that you can have, I believe, up to 200,000 people in a group, compared to, I think it's like 50 or something in WhatsApp. And so this allows the spread of disinformation and propaganda to go even, so much so that, and this is actually something I just learned yesterday, but so much so that the maker, we know that it's the Russian founder of Telegram, but 3 days after February 24th, he announced that he was going to shut down Telegram for Ukrainians and Russians, because of this very fear that it could spread. It has everything has benefits. You know, it's like, is it the gun that shoots? Is it the person behind it? We know all this philosophy, but you know, you got quite a lot of backlash for that. So Telegram, it's there. So no, other than the trends that, and I won't rehash what's already been said, their use. Sorry, I don't know what's going. Yeah, sorry. Their use of social media there, as I said, primarily there's, and I'll just end with one key study that looked at a number of themes of false narratives of, you know, over 1,000 documented posts from Telegram, and the key themes, the first one, the accusation of Nazism, then the demonization of the enemy, the second being NATO's power in the war, the whole notion of not 1 inch more, the notion that the Ukraine is staging the war, You know, that comes up, and as Julia said, this is gives a lot of strength to what is happening in the US, and will invariably happen without the regulation. And I don't see that coming anytime soon on tech. But with the notion of crisis actors, the notion that this isn't happening, and the notion is the notion of Zelensky using a green screen. And so, and also the next one, that the Russian army is winning. Anti-Ukrainian sentiments in the West, the UK army poses a threat, and specifically that Zelensky himself poses a threat. And finally, how they do this, and this is all on the thing that, and these are in 60% of the cases, the images were taken out of context. In 30% of the cases, the images were edited or manipulated. And in 10% of the cases, they were real images with fake captions. And the rest, the other, were just primarily videos and context used to promote a specific issue based on those three things. So they've got a limited application, like as in the app's use of social media, but they're using it, you know, quite well. And as I said, some may laugh at the stuff that's being put out, but you know, if it keeps, and this is nothing new. I always say digital diplomacy, but this is not a revolution; it's an evolution. This is just simply the speed and the quantity and the extent of the propaganda disinformation is nothing like we've ever seen before, but the underlying conceptual notions of it all still very much solid. I wish they weren't, but yeah.
Thank you, and we'll circle back to the issue of Telegram momentarily also, but let's first turn to Ivana again. Ivana, Russia has a huge foothold in some Baltic countries, and some would argue that the Kremlin is increasingly expanding its media presence in the region. Can you talk to us about how the expansion of Kremlin propaganda outlets impact on how the Russia-Ukraine war is being portrayed and perceived, and do you think it matters ultimately? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon. To begin with, like to explain something like that in 2 minutes will be almost impossible, but I will do my best to give you a huge overview. And again, while everyone is paying attention to the Balkans since February 2022, I have to tell you that Russia has been investing tremendous resources in the Balkans for at least, the past 10 years in the media space. So not only that Sputnik and RT operate there, I've heard that RT also plans to open a TV station very soon, and that matters because running it from Serbia, it can be understood in all other languages in the Balkans, and that's number one thing. The second thing is Russia does not need to roll on tanks and jets in the Balkans. All they really need to do is to stir problems within, on the nations over there. What we, for example, saw yesterday between Kosovo and Serbia was a perfect example of how Russia was spinning immediately a story accusing NATO attacking Serbia, which is exactly the same narrative that Russia has been spreading inside Russia within the context of the war in Ukraine. We should also not forget that Russia also used information operations and setting informational conditions for a coup d'etat that failed in Montenegro, but also in North Macedonia when the country wanted to join NATO. Serbia is a very, very important place for them, again, not because Russia wants to occupy Serbia, but rather because it serves as a great ally that can actually serve Moscow's interest. As a matter of fact, just last week, the Serbian director of intelligence agency was in Moscow meeting with leaders there, probably including, Patrushev, who was on the same conference with him. And that matters because Serbia is a great place for them, based on the Slavic Brotherhood, based on religion, claiming exactly, the same narratives that they say is that the West is satanic, that the West also wants to destroy Serbia and the identity and religion. I will never, ever forget, on the day of a full-scale invasion, when they opened the Serbian newspapers on the cover page, the message was Ukraine attacked Russia. And they've been, spreading similar information regarding biolabs and nuclear weapons, like everything, that you can see on Telegram, I see as a replication, on the media over there. Some countries are more or less resilient. I do believe that, for example, when it comes to Kosovo has more resilience to Russian disinformation campaigns than some other countries, such as, for example, Serbia or Bosnia and Herzegovina, specifically Republika Srpska, where Mr. Dodik plays a very, very important role as an ally who also threatened with secession in the country that would actually cause a lot of problems. And the reason why Russia cares about that is because the more problems there are in the Balkans, the more the West will pay attention to the Western Balkans instead of paying attention to Ukraine. And that's a very similar strategy that Russia has been trying to impose in places such as Georgia or within the context of Armenia, Azerbaijan conflict. So very, very similar playbook. I do not actually think, that Russian information operations, as well as, information operations campaigns are fading in those countries. As a matter of fact, I also am very concerned, for example, right now, what's happening in Montenegro and how this is all spreading all over the place, and the role of media and domestic bloggers. I mean, you also have Russia has been investing tremendous resources in sports teams, in influencers, social media influencers who have been spreading such information operations campaign. And one thing that really, really worries me a lot is their support and investment in the youth, because I have never, ever seen nationalism among the youth so omnipresent, which is very unfortunately similar to what we can see right now inside Russia with the new generation Z. So I'm going to stop here, and for any other questions, I'll be happy to respond later.
Thank you, Ivana. Those are great points. And I want to remind our audience also that Russia has expanded significantly its media operations in the Balkans, particularly through Sputnik Serbia, of course, and RT also that recently expanded operations in the Balkans, where it's clear some studies show that there are narratives that come directly from the Kremlin and then churned out by these propaganda operations. Let's go back to Julia again. Julia, recently there were a number of intelligence leaks related to Kremlin narratives planned for the remainder of this year. Can you talk to us about those narratives and what you think they tell us about what the Kremlin plans to achieve going forward? Thank you.
Some of these narratives have to do with conspiracy theories that are already spreading in Western societies. For example, one of them has to do with spreading disinformation about alleged side effects of the COVID vaccine that are being supposedly hidden by the governments from their people. Others are designed to divide societies, like the Ukrainian society. One of them has to do with continuing to vilify Azov battalion that has been very effective in fighting against the Russian aggression. So alienating them, claiming that they are abusing other participants in Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression. So these are their narratives that are to be expected, more about the biolabs, bioweapons. So definitely more of what they've already been doing. Also, they're planning to expose the identities of some of the people involved in fighting back against Russia's information war. So I guess presumably exposing people that are operating under aliases. And I'm sure that they have been spearfishing and conducting all the informations that are so typical of them. So again, it's designed to divide societies within individual countries and also cause divisions between countries. One other narrative was to claim that Poland would send Ukrainian refugees back to the front lines. So there again, those countries that are seen as very instrumental in helping Ukraine fight back against Russian aggression, they will try to drive a wedge in between those countries and Ukraine. And it's basically more of the same of what they've already been doing, and designed to wear us out and divide us. And this has been something that has been articulated in the Russian state media. They are not doing so well on the front, but they're doing very well on the information warfare front. Head of our team, Margarita Simonyan, actually admitted that not only are they operating under the headers of RT and Sputnik, but they also are operating without identifying themselves in multiple languages. They started with 18, I believe she said, and planning to expand to over 30 languages. They're broadcasting in those languages and concealing their identity, so you wouldn't even know that you were watching Russian propaganda network. So they're very actively doing that, because in the end, that's what they say will most likely secure their victory. It's not a victory on the conventional battlefield, but on the information battlefield, because they think if they can wear out the West and make it tired, make it disinterested in continuing to support Ukraine, then Ukraine will be handed to them on a silver platter. So for them, it's a lot of that waiting game, and to see how they can wear us out and how they can divide us. That is their main objective, and that continues consistent with these recent leaks.
Thank you, Julia. Those are great points, especially on the expansion of languages, which I have certainly seen in some of the regions that I've also been observing. I've also noticed that there were, for example, there was a journalist in South Africa who also works for RT, and whenever she went to talk on one of the so-called independent radio stations, she never identified herself also as someone working for RT. So that's another issue, this illusion of objectivity, while you're working for an organization that is directly funded and directed by this government. Let's go to Jennifer again. You mentioned the importance of Telegram. Can you talk to us more about why this platform has become so important and how it's been used? Thank you.
Yep, and I'm just before we begin, I'm not an expert on Telegram. Well, I don't think anyone's an expert on anything in the sense of that. Anyone who calls themselves an expert on something is usually not the expert. But I certainly am no expert on Telegram's use. But with my focus being on other applications, but I have delved into this because this was certainly post my my formal research. I still research, of course, on the conflict and digital narratives, but this app was not simply created. And then so we're looking at it. Why? Well, first question being, why has it grown in importance? Well, quite simply, the other apps were blocked, except for TikTok. But we can see with TikTok, there's a geopolitical view on that, of course. It's China owned. And we know from TikTok and data collection that the algorithms are very, very different for the countries that they are putting out to. So very, very different messages and algorithms, and for you pages that certain age groups are getting in China versus another country. So it's very country specific. And so sorry, I thought there was one at my door. So Telegram, this was the app that they went to. And initially, as I said, I mentioned, it was because of its ability to be both private and public. But I'll get to the issue of security and actually how secure it actually is in a moment. This attracted many people to it, journalists, aid workers, and then politicians, and started getting on it. But it has very, very little scrutiny of content moderation. Again, whether this is a good or bad thing, this is a morality question. This is simply a technology viewpoint of it. But why, as I said, what distinguishes it, because you public and private feeds, photos and videos that can be sent. But where the kind of game change was when the Kremlin, well, we saw before I even make that point, when we or whoever will be writing on leaders in social media and this may be defined as the true first social media war, and we will look at Zelensky's power of social media, his ability to use it. And when I do a lot of consulting with foreign ministries and ambassadors in social media, and I say, well, you have to use the app the way it's intended. You can't, in a tweet, you can't just put out a press release. This is not, if you want traction, you have to use the app in the way it's intended. If you don't want to do that as a diplomat, that's fine. But you must know the parameters of this. So Zelensky's ability to know each app and to be able to engage in it, that power, that's you can call it hard power, soft power, smart power, whatever power you want to call it, what is truly going to be one of, and it is his greatest weapon in this both artillery and information war. So his use, the Ukrainians' use of Telegram, and then we saw the Russians deciding, well, we will get the Kremlin, we will get on this. And also for Russians themselves, Russian citizens, and please correct me if I am wrong in this, it is one of the only places where, other than VPNs and quite other arduous, somewhat arduous tasks, that they can locate independent sources and information. Yes, there's a host of disinformation and propaganda, but there's also that on Twitter. There is also this on Facebook. So that is one of the key reasons. Also, there's no advertising on it. The flow of information is not driven by an algorithm, which is huge. I don't know any other social media app that does that. So yeah, simply regarding, I'll end there to just, give time for other questions, because it's quite a simple answer. They were on it because it was, other than TikTok, it was the one social media, open social media avenue left. And two, they can get a huge, large audience. The ability to go viral is unlike any other thing, and it's very, very low monitoring of content moderation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Those are some great points. I'm going to turn to Ivana again. Ivana, what actions are being taken to counter Russian disinformation? Is there a difference of approach that you're witnessing among Western governments pre and post February 2022? And can you perhaps distinguish between the reactions by the US, UK, and the EU? Thank you.
So to begin with, I'm very pleased to see that more and more people understand how Russian information warfare doctrine operates and how it differs from the West in terms of countering Russian information operations campaign. I think after the full-scale invasion in February, the West has taken numerous defensive measures to build resilience, but not enough offensive measures to put Russia on the defensive. And this is, nothing new. However, it's still, the West has done numerous significantly more than, let's say, in 2014. Having said that, I would actually like to start with Ukraine because they build resilience since 2014 and they operate, they're very successful in both offensive and defensive information operations. They understand very well, on how to counter it in terms of not only banning Russian narratives in social media, but also countering in information space, whether, through a public diplomacy or, for example, numerous Telegram channel that I also follow, but also inside Russia, putting information operations, not necessarily by, trying to convince the Russians that what Putin is doing is bad, but rather, to portray narratives that Putin is weak, that he has destroyed, the great Russia, etc. Something that will resonate with them because culture matters, perception matters, and something that will resonate with people in the West might not resonate with people inside Russia. Having said that, so in terms of the West, I think here we have built numerous, especially in the European Union, measures to ban Russian social media, but also to ban their media platforms, including RT and Sputnik, for example, but also, for example, here in the United States, we have sanctioned even individuals that were responsible for information operations. Numerous, things have been done in terms of building resilience. Nevertheless, I still, and I don't perceive this from some, academic perception. I think very much as a military intelligence, from a military intelligence perspective. And I do believe that we should be doing significantly more when it comes to offensive information operations against Russia. Again, during the Cold War, we used modern art and jazz music and culture, to spread our values inside Russia. That's not going to be very helpful nowadays. But for example, I'll give you a very concrete example. Every time when Russia spreads disinformation campaigns in the West related to allegedly our bioweapons, I think we should actually put Russia on the defensive and to talk about Russian bioweapons program completely to create new narratives. Or, for example, right now, you have a huge problem within the CST, or what I like to always call Russia mini NATO. When Armenia asked Russia for help with a conflict, its conflict with Azerbaijan, and asked Russia to invoke Article 4, which is equivalent to NATO's Article 5, Russia put its ally under the bus. What was a great opportunity for the West to use that and to launch offensive information operations, especially in the global South, telling people, that Russia is not a reliable ally. And to, in that sense, to humiliate and also to degrade the importance of Russia. Again, I do understand that for many people in the West, some people might be outraged, by saying this, but that's precisely because after decades of living in La La Land and Disneyland, this is why we live in the information space that we live. And that's something that is, in my view, necessary to do. Again, some people claim you never know, what the intelligence community is doing. Probably that's correct, but nevertheless, I would love to see more of it.
Thank you, Ivana. Let's go back to Julia again, and we're going to pick up on some of those points again, Ivana. But let's ask Julia. There's a question from Steve Jones, and I hope I can summarize this question of yours. Could you speak about the part played by narratives of victimization in Russia's propaganda in the West? Is there a risk that the self-portrayal of Russia as a victim of NATO aggression will catch on in the West and dissuade support for Ukraine? And I think that question by Steve Jones also relates to something that I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned it, you sprinkled it into the conversation earlier. You argued that the Kremlin is increasingly propagating the narrative that NATO is fighting against Russia and Ukraine. What is the purpose of that narrative? Is Putin possibly preparing the Russian nation that trying to sort of just lower their expectations in terms of what they can expect with regards to the outcome of this war? Or what's your analysis there, Julia?
Well, with the way this war is going, it would be too shameful for them to admit that they're losing to Ukraine, having for years and years portrayed Ukraine as someone who is a weak nation. They have speculated they could take it in 3 days, that they could take Kiev in a matter of 10 minutes. So they could not admit that they're doing so poorly because of the way Ukraine is fighting back. By blaming NATO, they could say, well, look, we're fighting against 50 plus nations. Of course, it's difficult. Of course, we're struggling. And that's because we are at war with NATO. And as far as getting people in the West to commiserate with them, because of our freedom of speech, because our people tend to be self-critical, it might work with some, because we tend to look inward to blame the United States where it rightfully did some things it shouldn't have. But when Russia is claiming it's doing it because NATO did something or because the United States did something, we should point out every single time that all of the actions that they supposedly oppose, now they say they're emulating. So what is their position? Was it bad when the United States invaded some countries, but now it's good when Russia invaded Ukraine? Because they're contradicting themselves. They were condemning it when other countries did it, and perhaps rightfully, we are not perfect. But the difference is the West is willing to admit its past mistakes, own up to them, work to do better, shed the colonialism, the imperialist narratives, and Russia instead is doubling down. And their propagandists are very openly admitting that, yes, Russia is an empire, we're expanding, like it or not. And that when they were supposedly condemning us, they were in fact jealous and wanted to do it themselves on an ever increasing scale. So when they're talking to people in the West that tend to be self-critical, they're going to exploit it to say that you're at fault, you did this, so who are you to tell us to do things differently? And with help of some useful idiots in the West, it might have some effect on certain people. So they are certainly pursuing that. They are promoting the narratives that they find to be convenient. And also, they're telling people in the West that you have your own problems. On top of that, you're not so great yourself, so why don't you just mind your own business? And some people might tend to agree with them, and they're going to exploit it every chance they get.
Thank you, Julia. Those are great points also. And if you have to drop off, please drop off. But I'm just going to ask one more question to Jennifer and Ivana also. Let's go to Jennifer first. There's a question from Corey in our audience saying there's broad evidence that far-right accounts and pro-Putin influencers now have more exposure on Twitter. I guess that also relates, of course, to the ownership change of Twitter. Jennifer, what do you think we could anticipate from Russia on platform increasingly favorable to them? Thank you.
We can anticipate on. I just didn't catch the end of.
Oh, sorry. So it has to do with the fact, you know, this ownership question of Twitter. So I guess
impact,
Corey wants to try and understand, you know, how has Twitter's ownership essentially changed, impacted on narratives in the Twitter sphere?
Hugely. And it goes back to what I keep talking about the foreign policy of Silicon Valley. So for people who may not know, but they are beginning to have an increasing number of legitimate embassies, accredited embassies, not consulates, not just simply buildings. Denmark has had an embassy to Silicon Valley. Since 2015, they're on their second ambassador. Never since 1500s, Machiavellian Italian city-states have we ever seen this happen, where there is an embassy to anything other than a nation state. And it just shows you the power that this is, and whether this should be happening now. France is going to follow suit, and the European Union is also said to follow suit. Again, whether this is right or wrong, perhaps another panel. But what I'm saying is, it's the power that these companies have and the power that the ownership has on a war and on narratives and on the ability to push them out in mass forms is recognized by foreign ministries and leaders around the world. And if whether it's closed doors or open doors, it is recognized. But it has, there's no doubt that it has impacted it. And there's a mass of data, you know, I said in the chat, I can send on links about that. We've covered that there's one key case that, you know, people might know about, Dmitry Medvedev, you know, a leading government official, but he posted after Musk took over, a tweet titled, "Why will Ukraine disappear? Because nobody needs it." And he did the same narrative of the Nazi regime. And this is quote unquote blood-sucking parasites. I won't even go on with the narrative. And the post was received like 7,000 tweets and relikes and had a huge. And this, and I'm actually direct quoting here, when Musk was approached, and this is in the very early days, and it has his standard has stayed the same, when he was approached saying, well, should language associated with genocide, particularly untrue, you know, narratives of such, be allowed, he said, quote, "All news is to some degree propaganda," end quote. And then he went on and said, quote, "Let people decide for themselves," end quote. And again, swinging back to the Hannah Arendt quote, you know, that, so there is, with that, first of all, the leader's philosophy. The second step is, from the moment there was the changeover, we saw an influx. You know, I'm looking, this is from our work, I'm looking at a graph right in front of you about RT, the influx of followers. And everyone was saying that there was shadow banning of all these accounts, you know, and you know, indeed, perhaps there were, but there was a hemorrhaging of accounts on one side and a mass influx on more right-wing accounts, or simply disinformation accounts. And you know, his that quote alone, "Let people decide for themselves," you know, it is quite linked to the Telegram aspect, as in Telegram is, as I said, not monitored, but the underlying mantra of Telegram is tech will set you free. You know, it's not here to just tech should you like look the other way when reading. You know, this is not, they're quite different philosophies, even though the algorithm and the fix might be the same, but certainly, and I've noticed, and I'd be interested to hear other panelist members on Twitter, but I've certainly noticed that Well, if anyone who follows me, I know that they know I didn't tweet during my PhD. I just used it as a research to gather data. I only started tweeting because of Brexit and Northern Ireland. My family are from Northern Ireland and lived on the border during the war in the 70s. And I just said, okay, now I'm going to start speaking because like not in my name will ever be a hard border reintroduced and like war on my island, like my island, but the island again. And that's how I started doing it. But I have noticed that anything I say like that now, which used to just be, gain completely normal traction, good traction, sometimes hardly anyone sees it. And I regularly put out things saying, do people see this? And most responses, no, I don't see your account anymore, or I don't do this. And that's because I talk a lot about, the colonization or the aspect or, issues on that. So certainly, without a doubt, when we are looking back, and I hate to, it seems, such a privileged position to be sitting here saying, when we're looking back, analyzing this, I really don't mean it like that. This will certainly be a key chapter in it, the handover of Twitter, because of its ability to capture the West, and also Russian diplomats, pro-Russian advocates to use it. And the more discerning information you have out there, and disparate information, and tying it back to Hannah again, saying, when people don't know what to believe, that's the worst. When truth becomes questionable, when objective fact becomes, is it? You have a problem. And I think that is an issue with Twitter.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you also for highlighting the importance of these social media companies. I remember around 2010 or 2011, there was a British diplomat and ambassador, in fact, who I think coined the word Twitplomacy, Twitter diplomacy.
It's Simon McDonald. Yeah.
So this idea of having even ambassadors accredited to Twitter, and the Twitter sphere, that is something quite fundamental, but it does show the impact of these platforms, and even though they are designed to be neutral, they have very real impacts on people on the ground. So that's it. Ivana, why don't you close us off? I know you love to make policy recommendations. Also, you spend a lot of time in DC. And so what are your main policy recommendations to counter Russian information warfare? Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, it's tremendously important to build resilience and to make people aware of how information warfare actually functions, but also to ban different social media, as well as to sanction. I don't think that's enough. If you've been following my work, and I know that you've been doing that, I'm a huge proponent of doing offensive information operations and give Putin a taste of his own medicine. So his intelligence can spend time, energy, and resources on defending themselves. If the Russian military pays so much attention to information warfare, and that's a critical component in their hybrid warfare doctrine, believe me, they hate it. And as a matter of fact, they already believe that we are doing that. I always like to make a joke. If they believe that we are doing that, maybe we should be doing that. Again, in terms of, I would never, love the United States, for instance, to spread disinformation campaign inside Russia, because the truth is on our side. But I also do not believe that apparently, for example, spreading narratives about democracy promotion, etc., that will also not resonate with Russia. I think we should definitely tell the truth how Putin has humiliated Russia, and because Russians are very proud, they want to live in a great Russia. I think there are numerous psychological warfare messages that we can use to help, with that narrative. As I stated, we also, I think, should be doing things more globally to tell the truth and about Russia's invasion, but not, for example, in Global South. I'm very concerned what Russia is doing in Africa in terms of the food shortages that can actually, with the goal, to cause chaos over there, and then the further refugee crisis, which would be a dream come true. I don't think that we are, for example, very present there. As a matter of fact, Russia is right now, Lavrov is in Africa. They're organizing Africa-Russia summit in a few weeks. And Putin already gave an assignment to his historians, for example, to rewrite the history on colonialism. And the United Kingdom, for example, should take advantage of that. And because they will be the key target in Africa, and they should actually spread the messages that Russia is also a colonial power, but a bad one, but a weak one, that someone, who could have achieved its goal, but Russia is just, has poorly performed. Again, I understand that for many people in the West, messages like this one I just gave you, just a couple of ideas, might not resonate, and they will think, that will not, as a democracy, we should not be doing that. I firmly disagree, because if Russia has been using weapons on the ground, but also weapons in the information space, I do not see anything wrong with using cognitive weapons as one of the most powerful strategic non-nuclear weapons that can help to win this war. Because if the Russian military values military measures 4-1, we better meet them in this space as it should be.
Thank you, Ivana. Those are great points. I do think there's more to be said for sure on reframing this war as a form of Russian colonialism, which I think is deeply necessary in terms of engaging the global South, also given strong feelings of anti-colonialism and also just how Russia situated this war. But that's a discussion for another day. Julia Davis, Jennifer Cassidy, Ivana Stradner, thank you very much for a very informative discussion. I am deeply honored that all three of you joined us today for another Russia-Ukraine dialogue, and I hope to have you back in the future. To our audience, thank you again for tuning in. Also, join us for our next Russia-Ukraine dialogue on rebuilding Ukraine, challenges and opportunities. The event will take place in the run-up to the conference on reconstruction scheduled in London in a few weeks from now. Thank you again, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.